So we want to welcome everybody again to tonight's presentation on the March 1st and 2nd high winds and Arctic blast. I'm Joe Delle Carpini, the Science and Operations Officer, and with me is my friend Tori, who's been with us before. He's going to help go through this event with me, and he'll also give us a briefing on the tornadoes going on in Alabama at the end. So Tori, I will let you start it off. Hand it off to you.
Sounds good, Joe. Thank you very much for the introduction. Seems like early March was more like several months ago at this point, but we're going to start things off by looking at a bit of the damage that was caused by this wind event. Starting off first with Connecticut, you can see a lot of the damage were to trees, many of them kind of snapping in half. Kevin sent in this picture you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, kind of showing some of the damage of trees snapping off, doing some minor roof damage, it looks like, to that structure there on the left-hand side. Then we have this photo on the right showing another tree that fell in East Hartford, coming down on that unfortunate shed. But this was typically the damage that we saw across southern New England. Moving on to Massachusetts, I believe, is next. You can see there in Chelmsford, Mass, shutting down portion of Main Street at a time because of the tree that snapped off about maybe 15 to 20 feet above its base. And over in Lexington, similar story here. Looks like another pine tree that may have snapped right off just at the base, falling during the overnight hours. And very similar story continuing into Rhode Island, just mainly these pine-like trees, which are more susceptible to snapping off in higher wind events, falling on a garage there in Foster, Rhode Island, and on the East Avenue, actually in my hometown, actually, of Harrisville, Rhode Island, there doing some damage to the roof as well. So behind all this wind, we did draw down some pretty cold temperatures, but here's a look at the peak wind gusts that we saw throughout the event. You can see really a widespread, 40 to 50 mile an hour wind gusts with some locally higher amounts. Mount Tom actually was one of the highest wind speeds, gusting to near 71 miles an hour, but you can see the higher elevation there in Worcester County out towards the airport, gusting to about 62 miles an hour. But additionally, we saw some pretty significant winds over the water, which we'll talk about how that impacted our marine forecast in just a little bit. All right, let's take a look. Power outages, they were this wasn't a minor thing in Massachusetts. At this one point in time, there were over 25,000 customers without power across the Commonwealth, and you can see majority of those were focused in the central, eastern, and western part of the region. Southeastern Massachusetts, you can see that there weren't anything lighting up in that area. Not to say that there weren't any strong winds there, but the winds that were causing some of the tree damage to knock down some power were out in Worcester County and then into the Connecticut River Valley. And it's important to note that it's not like we had some warm weather with those 25,000 customers without power. Wind chill just before 6 a.m. on that Tuesday morning were in the single digits on either side of zero, with a few places like Fitchburg. Look at that, -11 was the feel-like temperature just before 6 in the morning. So without any power or a secondary heat source, it definitely is a serious situation when you don't have power to warm your house and you have these bitterly cold temperatures. All right, so let's kind of look what we had to forecast. Our challenges were how strong were these winds going to be, and when were the gusts going to be the strongest? When were they going to subside? Because we can't be sending out, or utility crews can't be sending out their folks during these strong winds to restore the power. So that was one of the things we had to look at first. Additionally, were the wind chills, were they cold enough to cause freezing spray on our coastal waters? And that, coupled with the gusty winds, can make for a very challenging forecast as well. And what type of impacts are we going to experience during this type of an event, down trees and power lines? And what kind of issues can we see with our coastal waters, especially with the vessels that are out doing those, getting the fish and the lobster, all that yummy seafood that we love to eat. All right, let's head on to the next page, Joe. You can see we're looking at the 500 millibar analysis. This was Monday evening. You can notice the top right-hand side part of that screen. You got that closed-off low that's sitting over Ontario and Quebec that's kind of pushing south, and you can see those winds aloft. They were howling. You can see those wind barbs. You can see anywhere about 90 to almost 100 knots of wind at the 500 millibar level. And what we need to look at is how much of that significant wind is going to mix down. So that was something that we were looking at first. So once again, this is a 500 millibar low that was centered up in Canada, coming in out of Ontario. We were also looking at the low-level lapse rates, because depending on how steep those lapse rates are, kind of shows us how much wind and energy we can mix down. So across New England, we were looking at lapse rates greater than 7 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So that's going to help to mix down some of those stronger winds. And this is favorable for high winds. So this was, once again, another ingredient that was being added into this overall system and what we were looking at. So here was the HREF forecast at 850 millibars, so roughly 500 feet for the wind speed and temperatures. You can see some of those stronger wind gusts at 850 were centered over the eastern slope of the Berkshires, anywhere from 65 to 70 knots of wind at 5,000 feet, along with the higher terrain of the Worcester Hills down into northeastern Connecticut, looking at winds there around 60 to 65 knots. So definitely good signal for some damaging winds, and these winds would likely be able to mix down because of those steeper lapse rates, and also going to enhance that cold air advection and bring in some of that colder air at the end of the system. So let's move ahead. I believe we have a animated GIF that shows widespread 40-knot winds there. That is the area of the yellow to mustardy color at the eastern slope of the Berks over into the higher terrain of Worcester County and well off into the Maritime as well. You can see that in those colors. And we did have some pretty good confidence with many of our members showing that 40+ knot wind gust potential. A few of the members actually showing 50 knots and higher across the higher terrain. Now, all the members were showing some storm force gusts over the water, which is 48 knots and higher. And we actually did issue storm warnings over the waters because of those stronger winds that were expected. All right. Now, another thing that we also look at is the NBM. You may hear us talk about it. It's the National Blend of Models, and it's a blend of the models and statistical guidance. And the blends are used usually to show, our confidence in the overall forecast. And as you can see, we had about 30 to 40 knots worth of wind over the land and 40+ knots over the water. Take, the guidance from the NBM and the other global models, and that's how we kind of worked into our forecast of how strong these winds were going to be. And it really did point out the significant winds over the water, and that did lead us to, once again, hoisting those storm warnings over the water. And Joe, we can advance to the next slide. So this is what we know so far. The upper air pattern signals for the potential for that damaging wind and surge of Arctic air across New England. Now, the closed upper low is coming out of Ontario. We saw that in one of the very first slides, along with those steep lapse rates, which is going to help to mix down the winds from the upper atmosphere down to the ground. Now, the high resolution guidance did also show good agreement for widespread gusts of 40+ knots to about 50+ knots over the higher terrain. And once again, the storm force winds about 48 knots there over the waters. All right, so what we're looking at now is a model cross sounding over Worcester. As you go up in up the axis, that's height, and as you go across the bottom, so that's the y-axis, the x-axis at the bottom is our time. Here we're looking at the wind contour. The blue line is showing where the 50-knot wind contour is. You can see as it gets kind of closer to the surface around 7 o'clock Monday night. That wind contour continuing off to the left, showing that's where we'll see it through early Tuesday morning. And that time period right there, we have that kind of circled off, I should say, squared off in that orange box, showing a period of about 50-knot plus gusts. So we were looking at that time frame for Monday night through the early hours of Tuesday morning. Model cross-section continues. Our first guess, as I had said, the timing would be for the high winds between 7 p.m. Monday night through early Tuesday morning. Now, I know Joe was working with me on this forecast, so I'm not sure if he wants to add in anything as we kind of go along.
Yeah, no, you can keep going, Tori. That's fine.
Okay.
But it's
So
the
using the
Sure, go
oh,
ahead. We're going to look at some soundings next, which really kind of nail down kind of the speeds. But go right ahead.
yeah, absolutely. So what you're looking at here is kind of an illustration of what a sounding looks like. You got temperatures we're going to find on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis will be the elevation going up. And typically, as we go up in the atmosphere, temperatures are decreasing, and then we can hit an inversion where actually it starts to warm up as you go up in an elevation. So let's take a look now at some of those soundings, Joe. So here's a forecast sounding for Westfield, so out in Western Mass. The deep sounding was showing us that we could definitely see some of deep mixing to promote that stronger wind gust. And we were able to mix up from the ground almost all the way up to 750 millibars, and the winds there are around 60 knots. So you're going to lose a little bit of that momentum as it comes down to the ground, but still a pretty good signal that we could get some gusts up to at least 50, 55 miles an hour. Maximum wind gust there, you can see is 60 knots, which is about 69 miles an hour. So our first guess where wind gusts would be around 52 miles an hour, but could be as high as about 69 miles an hour. Now, when will it be safe for our power restoration people able to get back to work? Because this is the big thing. When we have these strong winds, we can't, well, I shouldn't say we, but the power companies can't be sending out their utility workers to get into these bucket trucks when winds are about 35 miles an hour, 30 knots or greater for safety reasons. So showing us where that could potentially still be occurring was through early Tuesday morning. So if you lost power around 11 o'clock Monday night or midnight Tuesday morning, there was a good chance that the power company wasn't going to be able to get out and turn your lights back on because winds are still gusting to well over 50 knots. But as we go throughout the early morning and early afternoon, we see that the wind gusts are coming down below 30 knots sometime between that 4 a.m. and 8 p.m. Closer to that 8 p.m. time frame is when those wind gusts were going to start to come down, allowing for the power restoration crews to work their way on out. So from this model, the cross-section in Worcester showed that the gusts would probably stay at least above 35 miles an hour through Tuesday night. So that's why it may have been a little slow for the lights to come back on in your neighborhood. And one of the other concerns, you get all this wind coming off the water is still hovering just above freezing, is the freezing spray concern. Now, for many people, this is a product that you may overlook, but if you make your money in the fishing industry, this is a product that you're going to look at. So we had some medium confidence that we were going to see a high rate of freezing spray Monday night into Tuesday morning. Now that can play a really significant hazard for vessels. And even towards the very tail end of this GIF, you can see some red that pop up. That is the high likelihood for freezing spray. And that is ice accretion on vessels. Let's move ahead to the next slide, Joe. The most dangerous form of freezing ice on vessels, this happens when there's freezing temperatures above the sea, above the water, around 28 degrees, with winds about 18 knots or higher. Now, the lower the air temperature and the stronger the wind, the more rapid that ice can accumulate. And the most common for southern New England waters, this happens in January and February. Now, as ice builds up on the vessel, the ability to right itself decreases. You can see this image of a vessel that's kind of covered in sheets of ice from freezing spray. Now, if it weighs too much, it will add to this factor of righting itself up. And if there's too much ice, potentially it could cause the boat to roll or capsize. And every new layer of ice creates more surface area for the next layer, so it kind of grows exponentially. And we actually have a case, the Lady Grace capsized in Nantucket Sound in January of 2007 due to that icing. And that's actually a photo courtesy of the Coast Guard. And maybe Joe can add in on this because this this event happened before I got here could maybe weigh in on how this capsizing of the Lady Grace impacted the fishing industry. But you can see this map just below shows the amount of boats that are out over Georges Bank, the Great South Channel, that are out there fishing. And, definitely a huge part of the industry for seafood in southern New England. So, Joe, I'm not sure if you can maybe add in a little bit of context on the Lady of Grace, excuse me.
Yeah, so Tori, that was an event you said happened back in 2007 during a heavy freezing spray, and it was actually wasn't far offshore. It was in Nantucket Sound. So even in some of the nearshore waters, the freezing spray is a significant hazard. And as a result of that accident, two things came out of it. One was there was the new wave buoy or the weather buoy in Nantucket Sound. For those who are fishermen or check the buoys, it's buoy 44020, which is pretty much right in the middle. And also some research was started, and we'll actually touch on this in our research webinar coming up in a couple of weeks. We work with UMass Dartmouth. They actually came up with a computer model that can help predict vessel icing. So there was some research money, granted for that to help, the fishing industry kind of avoid these situations. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in our webinar, talking about our office research in April. But you can see, like Tori mentioned on the map, all of these vessels in orange are fishing vessels, and a lot of them come out to Georges Bank, the Great South Channel, the Northeast Canyon there, from Canada, but also from New Bedford and areas near the coast. And they're out there for days at a time. So they really need to have a good heads up of freezing spray when it's going to occur. So we try and predict this, at least on the order of 3 to 5 days ahead of time, at least get it into the forecast. So, not something you might think about, during the winter time, but certainly for our fishing industry and even, for some of the year-round ferries, it's certainly a significant concern.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Another thing that you, as a member of the public, don't see often is our behind-the-scenes briefings that we put together for the states. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. We disseminate these to the local emergency managers from the state level down to the town level, and we try to get out typically at least a one-pager. If not, we'll send out kind of a slideshow PDF of our forecast. But what you're looking at here is what we call a one-pager in the office. We try to get the overview out. We put down the timing of whether it's going to be wind or snow. In this event, obviously, we were dealing with wind, but we were also dealing with, the significant cold coming in behind it. So we were laying out all these, hazards for the local emergency managers, putting it there for the timing, the hazards, what alerts we had out. At the beginning, we just had the wind advisory, but by the end, we had a wind advisory, a wind chill advisory, a gale and storm warning, and freezing spray advisory. So it's good for us to put all this out there. That way they can prepare, whether it be if we're going to have a prolonged power outage, they can possibly plan a warming shelter, considering that we had the chilly weather and the strong winds all kind of coming together at the same time. And speaking of that chilly weather, we're taking a look at images that are courtesy of Plymouth State. Temperatures were in the teens and low 20s with a northwest wind gusting as high as 40 and 45 knots. So you can see those temperatures there. Surface temperatures in the single digits out in Western Mass, low to mid-teens in Worcester County, upper teens in the Boston area to the low 20s in Providence. And then along with that, this was also, we're looking at the winds about almost 41 degrees, 41 to 43 mile an hour, 43 knots, I should say. Kind of gets a little confusing when we jump back and forth between the knots and the miles per hour. But needless to say, rather gusty winds as we were going through the wee hours of that morning. And here's a look at the sounding in Chatham. 7 a.m. on March 2nd. Note that there was a deep mixing layer going up to just about 800 to 790 millibars, and the winds there were rather gusty, probably at the highest. Looks like it was probably about 70 knots worth of wind in Chatham coming out of the northwest, and we were trying to see how much of that we can mix down to the surface as well, and that's what gave us some of those stronger winds out over the water. And in just as a note, we'll be stopping those soundings come the end of the month. I'm sure Joe can go into it in a little bit more detail as well. But Chatham will be suspending soundings come at the end of the month due to unforeseen, I guess, erosion. But Joe can add more on that a little bit later, as that's starting to make headlines across the area.
Yeah, I can mention something now, Tori. So the site out at Chatham is on Monomoy Island, if you're familiar with it, and there's been quite a bit of erosion on the bluff. So at this point, the bluff is eroding to the point where it's not safe for the balloon launches to take place and for visitors to actually walk along the trail there. So the site's being discontinued at the end of March. And we're in the process now of working with our national headquarters of trying to find a new home. So probably will take a year or two by the time everything is contracted out and a new, building is built to house the balloons as they're inflated. But we're hoping it'll be somewhere on Cape Cod when it's all said and done. But yeah, unfortunately, we won't have any more soundings after the end of the month, but we will have some continuing from Portland, Maine, Albany, New York, and out on Long Island, which should pretty much, it'll do the job for now until we can get the new station up and running.
All right, thanks, Joe. And on top of this, we had some really cold temperatures, record setting, actually 850 millibar of minus 21°C. That was near the record for the daily minimum for March. So we had some anomalous cold air aloft, and that helped to bring down those really chilly weather conditions as we went into Tuesday on that. The day after, we had that significant wind. And here's a look at some of the peak wind gust reports Monday night into Tuesday. North Adams, 60 miles an hour. Pittsfield, 60 miles an hour. Worcester, 62 miles an hour. There were also frequent gusts of 58 miles an hour Tuesday, which delayed the power restorations. And so those happened Monday night, and during the day on Tuesday, Westfield had 61 miles an hour, Fitchburg 58 miles an hour, and Windsor Locks at 58 miles an hour as well.
Yeah, and Tori, just to note that the time frame on all that, notice it's Monday night, kind of into early Tuesday, which you showed on that forecast sounding. But remember, you showed in Worcester the winds were going to kind of stay up all day, which they ended up doing, and obviously that delayed our power restoration there.
Absolutely. All right, and here is Mount Tom. Mount Tom, their wind gust was 78 miles an hour at 11 o'clock at night and 4 a.m. in the morning. So you can see we were fairly in line with what we were forecasting in terms of when we were going to expect the strongest winds. Maybe just a few hours. The onset was a few hours kind of pushed towards midnight. But nevertheless, we were looking at some pretty strong winds that were starting to get up over at least 60 miles an hour around 9 p.m. and peaking at 78 miles an hour there just before 11. And once again, just after 4 o'clock, but still gusty winds right through almost, say, 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, still over 60 miles an hour. But we didn't get those wind gusts on Mount Tom to even come below 50 miles an hour until about 2 o'clock or so, almost noon on Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, Tori, and just to point out, I was, we were putting this presentation together, I was noticing, like you just mentioned, look at the duration of 50-mile-an-hour gusts. And granted, this is up on Mount Tom, which is elevated, but you're starting in essentially in the afternoon hours, going all through the night and all through the next morning. And really, like you said, a couple of drops here, but really not until Tuesday afternoon when it finally came down. So that really helps explain all the damage we saw out in western and central Mass and even Connecticut and the related power outages. So just a really long duration of those strong winds, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, absolutely, Jai. I remember, the following day, I know we were in the office the day prior to the event. I was at home the day of the event, and yeah, especially right through early afternoon, it was still howling out. I could hear the antenna, or I shouldn't say the antenna, but more or less the satellite dish on my house kept rattling pretty much throughout the day. And I know when that satellite dish is rattling, we got some pretty good winds out there. So
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's the end of the review part. If there's any questions, feel free to throw them in there. Or if you have a question about how, we kind of wanted to show you a little bit how we approach forecasting wind gusts. And then, of course, it's not just the numbers when it comes to wind, it's also the impact. So Are the gusts strong? And it's also what direction they're coming from that can cause damage too. In this case, they were west-northwest. In most cases, the trees are pretty much hardened for those kind of wind speeds of that direction. But when we see something out of the south, like we did with Isaias last summer, those strong winds tend to cause more in the way of tree damage. So, Tori, I'm actually not seeing any questions, so which is I think a
All
first
right.
for one of our webinars. But so maybe what we'll do is we'll continue. I'm going to have you, I guess, continue with the. We're going to take a quick look at the tornadoes here, but if we have any questions, feel free to use the chat box, and we will answer them as we go through.